really like Kent Doss, and I've intended to visit this location of this church for 2 or 3 years. But I'm married to a UU minister, so my Sundays are often very full, and I just haven't made it, so I'm delighted to finally be here this morning. If you're listening in, I'm 6'2". I have short, dark hair, dark eyes with a closely cropped beard. On my mom's side, I'm Mexican and Native American. Spanish was my first language, but I look exactly like my Scottish father if he had a tan. Exactly. Dad. My father's family, and that's where this begins, my father's family, the Ingalls family, landed on this continent 6 years after the Mayflower. So just shy of 400 years ago, what many would call a good long time. My mother's family has been here for about 20,000 years, if anthropologists are to be believed about indigenous peoples. I am the descendant of both conquerors and the conquered. Culturally, I'm Latino. I never knew my father, and I grew up with my mother's Mexican family in Los Angeles County. However, when I was 5 years old, my mom got involved with a religious group that mixed Hopi Native American and Far Eastern Indian beliefs and teachings. And after a few years of attending regular services there, a group of us moved to a commune together in rural Arizona that was located between a Navajo reservation and a Yavapai reservation. Cultural misappropriation is, among other things, the taking of intellectual property, traditional knowledge, cultural expressions, or artifacts from someone else's culture without permission. We were not doing that in this commune because we did have permission from and a relationship with the Hopi. So if we can put up the first picture on the slides, that's it. So this is a picture of the Escalante Canyon in Utah. It eventually joins up with the Grand Canyon. Journeying on a 3-week-long backpacking hike, sleeping out in the open next to the river every night in this canyon near Hopi lands. For the first time in my life, I looked up and I saw a massive blanket of stars that I had never seen before. We were hundreds of miles from any city lights, so there was no glare at all to affect our view of the stars, and it was stunning. While we were hiking through this canyon, we all took new names in an evening ceremony out there in the wilderness by the light of a large bonfire. Within that group and in the commune, from the ages of 9 to 14, I went exclusively by the name Navachi, affectionately shortened to Navach. So if you go to the next slide, for context, this is a picture of me in my undergrad volleyball days. Because of my genetics, I get very dark if I spend any amount of time in the sun. This should tell you how much time I spend in an office. My point being that I do own mirrors. I do know I'm usually pale enough to pass for white. So I want you to picture a dark-skinned, shirtless little Navachi with shoulder-length hair running around the Arizona desert, shouting at his mother in Spanish about each new and exciting discovery, and subsisting on a diet of Navajo fry bread, tamales and beans, and cheeseburgers. That was my childhood. It was not a typical American upbringing. It's not that unusual to be both Latino and Native American, and in fact, I was pleasantly surprised to discover through a genetic test that my mom was fully 1/3 Native American. We didn't know that until after she died. Ancestry.com can narrow down your indigenous genetics to a specific geography. Mine, it turns out, are Arizona and Mexico. And being Arizona, that means that they were either Hopi or Navajo or Apache or Zuni. The Hopi tribe was so influential in my upbringing, maybe by coincidence, maybe not, that Hopi values continue to inform my beliefs and my decision-making to this day. So it's really great having an actual genetic connection to the Pueblo tribes, even though we don't know specifically which one we are. I self-identify as Native American and Latino because it's both genetically correct, but also because the Hopi tribe was so influential in my upbringing. It's aggravating to me and others of indigenous descent when we hear people complaining about immigrants and borders and who should be here and who should not be here. I also find it a little bit triggering when I hear North Americans discussing conflicts or outright wars in other countries. And they talk about how one group of people should basically gut off the land of another group. I just can't imagine any one of those North Americans signing over their own homes, or where they gather for worship, or where they own businesses, and giving that back to Native Americans. I don't see that that scenario is ever going to play out. In many conflicts, who is wrong is determined by the date you start looking at behavior. I am not going to get into the specifics of North American history or current world politics, but this is what I know. All claims to land are temporary. Even if your people have been on land for 20,000 years, like my family has been here for 20,000 years in what is currently called California and Arizona. Before that, it was called the Western Territories of the United States. Before that, it was called Mexico. Before that, it was called New Spain. And before that, it was just called home by my family for 20,000 years. All claims to land are temporary. Here's the thing that millions of people all over the world do not want to hear. If your children's children, 30 generations from now, that's about 900, 1,000 years. If they still speak your language and still practice your religion and still hold your same culture, they will not have done so in peace or safety. The bitter pill, if you must characterize it negatively, the bitter pill of living in peace where your family's children can prosper for generations is being a genetic and cultural mishmash of, for example, Navajo, Scottish, and Mexican. My family has prospered for generations now, no longer being purely any one thing. My pagan Scottish ancestors 100 generations ago never dreamed that their descendants 50 generations later would turn their backs on the old ways, would become something called Catholic, and would speak English instead of Gaelic. Those Catholic Scottish ancestors of mine 50 generations ago never dreamed that I would speak Spanish and hold Hopi Native American values and spiritual practices that are much more in line with their own ancestors' beliefs and practices than anything that looks like Catholicism. The very human, very powerful desire to hold in your family the same language, the same religion, the same culture forever, for all of eternity, is not workable. Living in peace means both changing yourself and also changing your descendants. Today, if you are white and you speak English and you belong to a biblical religion, and you truly, in your heart, you want your children's children 30 generations from now to live in peace and safety, it's entirely possible that those descendants may look like African Buddhists who speak Korean. Nobody knows what 900 years from now is going to look like. But I'm certain that if 30 generations from now, your children's children still look like you, still speak your language, still hold your same religion, that does not happen in peace. That happens by rigidly holding to certain ideas, no matter what the circumstances. My mom's mom was the oldest of 7 or 8 children, so I have a ton of great aunts and uncles, regular aunts and uncles, and first, second, and third cousins. But I'm the only one in my generation or later who still speaks Spanish. A few years before my grandmother died, I observed out loud that when my mom and her sisters die, that I'll be the very last native Spanish speaker in my entire family. When I was born, a majority of the family was Spanish speaking. My grandmother shook her head very quietly and almost just to herself, she said, "Pues, supongo que estamos siendo borrados." Which means, well, I guess we're just being erased. My grandmother was a fiery, powerful woman, and seeing her look so defeated really made an impression on me. I'm certain that there are millions of people in the world who feel similarly, that if their children's children, however many generations later, don't look like them, don't speak their language, don't hold their culture, that they feel they're being erased. So maybe I'm a little bit reluctant to put a cheery spin on my own multiracial, multicultural identity, but on the other hand, I do exist. I'm the living embodiment of what scientists call heterosis, or hybrid vigor, or outbreeding enhancement. Basically, that means my genetic diversity makes me generally healthier and better able to fight disease than a purebred. And it's true. And while I do, sometimes I feel the absence of a centuries-long connection with both my Native American and Scottish ancestors. It's my choice whether I choose to focus on that lack, or instead to focus on the richness that is my genetic and cultural diversity, and I choose the richness. It's fascinating to me how I've seen ancestors deep in the past call out to the current generation. My mother, who believed herself to be a Los Angeles Latina, was powerfully drawn to Native American art and culture, having no idea that she herself was a third Native American. The Hopi connection of that commune we moved to was a huge part of the draw, the attraction of our moving to Arizona to join that commune. Because of the Hopi influence on my upbringing, it has always been normal for me to talk out loud to my ancestors, which now includes all of my parents and my grandparents. As soon as I got the email showing that my Native American genetics were specifically in Arizona, I knew from my childhood in Arizona that that meant either Hopi, Navajo, Apache, or Zuni. So I was saying out loud to my parents and my grandparents and all of my ancestors, I really want to figure this out, you guys. So the very next morning, I'm driving through rural Texas. I'm still thinking about that, and I'm on this highway. It's 6:30 in the morning. There's no one on the road, and the light that I pull up to turns red for no reason at all. So I stop, and I'm really annoyed because I'm looking around, and there's nothing for miles. And then I looked up, and I saw, if we go to the next slide, I took a picture through the windshield of the street that I was stopped at. No, it's the next one after that. That's it. So I'm stopped at Navajo Road. And I literally laughed out loud. And I said out loud to my parents and grandparents, good one. According to Google, there are almost 16 million intersections in the United States, but that's the one that I got stopped at out in the middle of nowhere, purely by coincidence. I've always spoken pretty freely about these kinds of experiences because they happen to me a lot. And I was well into my 20s before I realized that the average white person was humoring me, or believed that I engaged in magical thinking, or quietly suspected that I might have mental health issues. When I've been asked, you don't really believe in spirits and that kind of thing, right? I mean, you work at Caltech, you have a master's degree. My standard response is, I actually do. Either that or my being stopped at that intersection was a 1 in 16 million coincidence piled on top of numerous other such coincidences. That kind of thing really does happen to me all the time. Here's the thing, I'm not white, I'm very pale. But even at that, my life experience raised by a single Latina mom in a Mexican family gives me a very different perspective on life than the average you. And then you throw in the whole commune connected to the Hopi tribe thing, and I think many of you would be surprised at what I believe because of what I've experienced. My older brothers are much older than I am, and they grew up near San Francisco with my father's side of the family in a time when children still regularly played cowboys and Indians. One of my brothers was always staunchly an Indian. He's by far the darkest complected of all of us. And when we moved to Arizona, he was already a young adult, and we all noticed how much he looked like the Navajo guys who regularly came into town. Because we didn't yet know about our own Native American genetics, we thought the Navajo guys looked surprisingly Mexican. Like, that's how we made sense of that in our own minds. Why do they look that way? I think there's a last photograph of these two pictures. On the left is where we lived in Arizona. The commune was just a few hundred yards from Willow Lake. And on the right is the Escalante Canyon in Utah, where we would journey to be near Hopi lands, where the first time we were there, I took the name Navachi. The Hopi Reservation and the Escalante Canyon are each near the borders of what is currently called Arizona and Utah. Previous to this, I grew up just south of Pasadena, just east of East LA. It was very urban. And I was perfectly at home out there in the wilderness from the ages of 9 to 14. Just under the smaller arch that you see there on the left, that smaller arch is several stories high. The picture doesn't really do it justice. That's where, for the first time in my life, I ran around completely naked outside during what was supposed to be bath time, but what ended up being the first of many nudist romps up and down that riverbank. It took us 3 weeks to hike through that canyon. I was only 9 years old the first time, and I was pretty much covered in mud by the end of every single day. And let me tell you, in my teens, I cried and I raged against returning to Los Angeles when my mother announced we were moving back. I adjusted quickly, but I remember our first day back in the Los Angeles area. I looked at the asphalt streets and the concrete sidewalks and the brick buildings, and I thought, everything here is dead. As the descendant of both conquerors and the conquered, it's impossible for me to impartially judge my very existence. I'm openly biased in favor of my own life. At the same time, I'm certain I have ancestors who would have wished that I were still purely Scottish or still purely Native American, perhaps especially those more recent ancestors who may have slaughtered each other here on this continent. I have 2 parents, double that, and I have 4 grandparents, double that, and I have 8 great-grandparents, right? If I keep doubling it that way, just 20 generations back, I have more than 1 million ancestors. 30 generations back, and it's over 1 billion. And that's just the last 1,000 years. And that only includes my direct ancestors and none of their siblings or their other children. They're all dead. And every single one of them continues through me. Our languages have changed. Our lands have changed, our customs have changed. I live in a world where it's no big deal that people have walked on the moon, where children can watch live video feeds, not from all the way across the country, but from the planet Mars. I am the leading edge of everything my ancestors could have created. And as the youngest of 3 brothers on my mom's side, and none of us has any children, I'm also where we all come to an end. I am the final culmination of all of us. And that is as it should be, because nothing physical continues in the same form for all of eternity. Ever increasingly, it seems to me, we are expected in all situations to pick a side, throwing details and nuance to the winds in favor of sound bites and memes. Instead of simplifying conflicts by demanding people pick sides, what if, instead, there were an emphasis on teaching people how to have complex conversations? Instead of characterizing calls for peace as the calls for the destruction of one group or another, what we should all be doing is rallying for peace and safety, full stop. Calling for peace and safety for all is not a radical idea. But I keep seeing this enforced divide play out again and again in everything from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict to school shootings. The ridiculous truth of just 30 generations equaling 1 billion people is that if we don't already share ancestors with the people we hate, we're almost certainly going to share descendants with them. Our children's children and their children's children will literally be the same people. And we owe it to those people, to our own children's children, to learn this skill of complex conversations. Most of my friends and my acquaintances are liberal to very liberal, but most of my relatives are not. My husband and I are both the liberal nut jobs in each of our respective conservative families. So we don't have the luxury of existing in a liberal bubble. You don't know how I envy those of you who were born into liberal families and then you turned around and married into liberal families. What is that like? It is agonizing to grow up loving an adult relative who you realize in your own adult life is a racist and always has been, or misogynist, or homophobic. You don't just stop loving them. That's not how that works. It's really painful. I'm still learning this complex conversations skill. It's so much easier to torture people with my words, especially when they've offended me or hurt my feelings. But that doesn't really move anything forward. It's gratifying in the moment, but so far, for 2024, I've managed to keep my commitment of delayed gratification and greater engagement with people who I find challenging. I know from my own conservative loved ones that some people can't hold conflicting ideas as equal. They can't sit with ambiguity. I used to dismiss them as just not wanting to, or worse, really knowing what was true, but willfully choosing to be ignorant. I've come to believe that it's not willful ignorance, it's lack of ability. And certainty is comforting. Life is ambiguous and uncertain for a lot of people, maybe for most people. And in my opinion, people all over the world, not just in this country, are attracted to very rigid, black and white view of the world, churches and politicians, for the distinct lack of ambiguity that they offer. This is right, period. That is wrong, period. Certainty is comforting. And liberal communities, certainly UU communities, aren't just comfortable with ambiguity. It's often what we offer in sermons and promote as a general mindset. Of my most immediate ancestors, my parents and my grandparents, 3 of those 6 people could not have learned the skill of complex conversations. But I believe that I can, eventually. I believe when you and others are thrown together in a terrible situation, and you're the one with greater physical strength, or more money, or more youth, or more time, or more brains, it's on you to improve that situation for yourself and the others you're thrown in with. And being punitive in a terrible situation when you're the stronger one, richer, healthier, faster, smarter person, that's just being a jerk. It's on you. It's on me. It's on all liberal communities. I truly believe that the people most likely to be able to learn this skill of complex conversations are liberals. And that is and always has been, proudly, us. Yes? Thank you for listening to me this morning.